Hey YouTube, it's Earl, and I'm coming to you on a wonderful, muggy Louisiana Wednesday night. It's July 1st here, but I'm coming kind of wish you a early, happy 4th of July. And so um, I thought I'd give you a little bit of my take on the 4th of July and what it means to me as an American, and these are just kind of my extemporaneous thoughts. So it's more of a rant than a thought. But the 4th of July, well, I can say it's never been a huge holiday in my family. It's still always been an important one. I've grown up in a small town. That's the small town I moved back to 6 years ago, after living 16 years away, 4 years in Baton Rouge and 12 years in Orlando. And it's always been something that's been kind of the high point of the summer in our small town. It was a town that, even though you weren't supposed to shoot fireworks off in the city limits, almost everybody did it anyway. And we actually, there was behind my grandparents' house, there was an older gentleman, as far as I know, never married, and his name was Joe Riley. And no, Joe Riley Wilson, Joe Wilson. And he, when I knew him growing up in the 80s and early 90s, you know, he was that just nice old man who he walked around downtown, had a cane. He was probably in his 70s or 80s when I knew him. But when he would walk around downtown, he always had a suit on, had a cane, and had a hat. And he would always, if he passed a lady, was always tipping his hat. He was kind of the consummate gentleman of his day, and someone that, you know, I can quite frankly remember my mom telling me stories about. You know, he acts like a gentleman should act. He does what you should be doing, son. That you show women respect and you open doors for them, and he had all those things of kind of an old South kind of etiquette, the way a gentleman should act towards women. But each year on the 4th of July, he would do a fireworks show. So he had his home, a nice little, I think it was a 1 or 2 bedroom house that was directly behind my grandparents' house on a kind of secluded street, but it was in a neighborhood. But he had a big field out in front of his house, and he would buy the fireworks and buy lots of them. And my uncles and another set of family, we the Smiths and the Joneses. Okay, so I'm a Smith. That's my last name. I gave you enough information to find me now on the internet. So I'm Earl Smith. And but anyway, we had the Smiths and the Joneses, and each family had 6 boys, and the Joneses had more than just 6 boys, if I remember correctly. But they would go out into the field, and 12 of these boys, and they would shoot off fireworks for the fireworks show each year. And a good chunk of the town would come out and see it. I mean, you know, several hundred people in a town of, you know, 15,000. So it wasn't everybody, but it was big enough to me. It felt like the whole town is a, you know, under 10-year-old. And you know, it was always a fun time. And so it's kind of a highlight of the summer to shoot fireworks. We'd go over to my grandparents' house before, and they had a big backyard, and we'd do all the stupid things that you did as a kid, celebrating the 4th of July, where we're, you know, taking black cats and lighting them and throwing them at each other. And sure enough, you know, 1 or 2 might explode in your hand. We'd also did Well, I never did this, but I had older cousins. I've got 22 of them, or 21. Maybe I'm one of 21. So I've got 20 cousins on that side. And some of the older ones would light bottle rockets, and they would, spin them, throw them, so they'd rotate over in the air, and then they just, whichever way they were pointed when it lit, they'd take off, and they'd throw them back and forth at each other. Extremely stupid. Something that you would certainly get lectured for in these days if you were a parent and allowed your children to do such things. But that's what we did to celebrate the 4th of July. And I can't say that we ever talked about it a ton as far as its importance, the founding of this country and what it meant to us, but we certainly learned about it in elementary school. And it was, we learned American history, I remember in 3rd grade. That's when we kind of had our first bout of American history. I think we got American history about every 3rd year or so in my schooling. And so we would talk about American government and the way it was set up and why it was set up this way. But we, when we got to the 4th of July, it was always kind of a little bit more about the fireworks growing up. But at the same time, it was the 80s and the early 90s in my upbringing. And so the Soviet Union was still around, and we still talked about freedom and how America in many ways was different than every other country in the world. It was the Reagan years. And it's something we don't talk about much here anymore, that our founding as a country, and I know many other countries have since adapted and come around to kind of the American style of government. But our country, when it was founded, was the only country that started with the idea that the power in the country was derived from the people, not lorded over them from their rulers from above. Right? We didn't have kings here. We had elected officials who were empowered by the people to do their will. And that really makes us different. That our founding document set up and specified the things that the government could do. And outside of that founding document, at least the original idea as I understand it, was here's what the government does, and everything else is retained, and all the powers are retained by the people. And we have some glorious founding documents. Certainly when you think about our time now, the things that we're dealing with now, as far as all the commotion about racial equality and long years of, for lack of a better word, or not necessarily lack of a better word, but for many years of oppression of non-white Americans. All of the possibility of having that discussion was set up in our founding with those words written so many years ago by Thomas Jefferson, that all men are created equal. Right? All men are created equal and have certain unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's the American dream, right? That you can come here, or you're born here, and we start with the fundamental idea that the government cannot deprive you of life or liberty without due process, and that everybody should be treated the same under that law. even though there were long stretches of time where we applied that to a select group and we didn't apply it to the others. But that founding itself allows us to even have this conversation. That founding idea of all men being created equal is, to me, a certain amount of a pure American and Enlightenment idea. And I know the French Revolution in many ways tried to embrace very similar ideas, and that in many places in Europe they have embraced those ideas as well. And as democracy has spread throughout the world, largely on the influence from England and from the United States, and not that that's a pure English thing. I think a lot of certain of our ideas on government and elected and representative government certainly comes from Presbyterianism, which took a foothold in Scotland, but also had a strong input from John Calvin and Geneva. So there's a long Western tradition of this idea. So while I think there's much of it that's uniquely American and the American spirit that is present in our founding and our founding documents, it certainly has a long tradition from the Western world and the Enlightenment, and maybe its truest form and sense. So I know I have a lot of international viewers, and this is not a time that I'm trying to disparage your countries at all. I love our country and the ideas and the thought that went into its founding and how our government should operate, that the power should rest with the people. But even then, to set up checks and balances so that you made sure that the people were adequately represented, and still that power was dispersed among the people's representatives so that not one person wielded too much power. So when you think about the way it was originally set up, where you had the House, which was supposed to be the people's house. Those were the federal government representatives, the only ones who were elected directly by the people themselves. And so it's the reason why in American government, many of you may or may not realize this, but it's the reason that all revenue-raising bills, taxings, must come from the House. It must come from the people's representatives. It cannot come from the Senate and cannot start there and then go to the House. It has to start in the House, because to raise taxes and to raise revenues on the people, it must come from the representatives who were directly elected by the people. And the way we originally set up the Senate was not to be popularly elected among the people, but the senators were to be representatives of the state. And think about that these were supposed to, there are times, and I don't want to argue over constitutional amendments, but we changed that via constitutional amendment. When did we change that? In the late 1800s, early 1900s, where we went to direct election of U.S. senators by the people, so that the Congress now is completely directly elected by the people. But the original idea was that these senators were elected by the state legislatures, that's how those representatives got in place, because they were to be representatives of the state in the federal scheme, that they were to be the voice of the state. And therefore, you might have in the Senate chamber might be a little bit of, I forget who said the Senate was to be kind of the saucer, right? That the hot tea or coffee might overflow from the House and into the Senate, and that the Senate might have a cooling effect on the passions of the people's representatives, because those men were there to represent their states and to make sure that that the interest of their state, of the state legislatures, were being done. And so that you made it, I guess, somewhat difficult for maybe larger larger states that had a large portion of the representatives to get legislation through that might solely benefit those larger states. And so you had senators that were beholden to the state. And where I'm going with all of that is that I think when we talk today about the fact that we don't have politicians who, especially sometimes in the Senate, as acrimonious as that seems that it can be, that there could be some more collegiality among senators back then, that they weren't necessarily even, well, they were probably part of a national party. National interest mattered less to them. And having to be elected by the people mattered less to them. It was about how they were adequately representing the state's interests. And don't get me wrong, there were problems there. And that's the reason why we had an amendment and took that out of the state legislature's hands and gave it to the people. But when you think about the ingeniousness of that design, then you make all the law writing ability is given to the legislative body. Then you have another branch that is supposed to be the executive branch, that all he can do is really sign bills into law, right? So he can completely reject them or accept them, and then he must faithfully execute those laws as written, right? That the president, as originally imagined, was to be someone who didn't have a ton of power. In my opinion, regrettably, that has changed in this country. Congress has ceded more and more authority over to the executive branch to write its own rules for different parts of the economy, which then have the effect of law. To me, I think that's a bad feature of our government over the past 80 years or so. And I understand why it was done, and I understand the complexity of a modern economy, that maybe it's easier to do it that way, to put many of the rule writing and law writing in the hands of select experts. But when you go back to the founding of this country and its original ideas, were that there would be no law that passed. There would be no law signed into place except those laws that passed because the people's representatives voted them in. And from there, the country and its laws derived its authority from the people themselves. And it's a great country that we live in. It's a great country that has truly embraced the spirit that you can be whoever you want to be here. Certainly more so in recent years than it has maybe in times past. But that you're not pigeonholed from birth into any kind of profession, any kind of class. We're all here, and if you've got a good work ethic, and you've got great ideas, and you've got drive, and you've got ambition, and you're willing to do the hard work to gain skills and knowledge and ability, there's no one who's going to tell you you can't do that. Because if you got a company that tells you you can't do that, you can always go out and start your own. Free enterprise, capitalism, that you combine that with the idea of a democracy, and that the power is derived from the people and not from experts sitting in some far-off government that is planning everything out every 5 years and tells you what you can do and how much you can grow, and you're going to be a farmer, you're smart, you'll be a university professor. When you have and you allow the human spirit to decide what's best for it and to allow it to make its own choices, and you allow people to pursue things that are meaningful as they want to pursue them. Do you have problems? Yes. Because we're men, right? We're a fallen race, and there'll never be a perfect society. But, and again, as someone said, and I'm blanking who said it, it's not that democracy is the perfect system, it's that it's the best of all the broken systems that are out there. And I really, when I take a look at the way the government in this country is set up, that you have so much local control, that you have state governments that have a great deal of control and authority over their own territory, and then a federal government that's limited, should be limited in its scope and its ability, and this idea that we've committed to of all men being equal, and that each should be open to be free and to pursue his own wishes and his own happiness, makes this country great. And so on this 4th of July, I hope that you can find all the things that you love about this country. I know it's a trying time, and I know my rant last week was about, gosh, how crazy it is, and at times I'm tempted to feel hopeless too with our direction and with our political leaders. But when I sit back and I think about the way this wonderful country was started all those years ago, and the promise it still has going forward to be a country that will allow people to make choices for themselves, to be free, well, that fills me with some optimism and some hope that once again maybe we can be a shining city on a hill. Pray this 4th of July our light shines even brighter. And I hope it shines bright in your heart as well. YouTube, you have a happy 4th of July, and don't do anything stupid like I did with fireworks. Good night.